I like being curious. It makes you look at things, it makes you notice things, it makes you learn things. Sometimes what you notice is all around you, hidden in plain sight. Now, I've lived most of my life in a really small state, but if I look closely, fascinating finds are everywhere. Take graveyards, for instance. They lie scattered around the New England countryside, but until someone you know passes away, most people don't pay them much attention. But graveyards can teach you all about a place: its history, its sociology, its politics, its triumphs, its tragedies. Famous figures lie side by side with the unknown, and in most cases, a carved stone is the only tangible record of a person's entire existence. Wouldn't it be a shame if we never took the time to look at that stone and learn about one of our ancestors? So come on along and I'll show you some of the graveyards and gravestones I've explored over the course of my life. I hope I can inspire you to take a look at what might be right around the corner from where you live.
Imagine it's one of those beautiful summer days where everyone is enjoying the weather. And you happen to be cycling through, I don't know, let's say Cornwall Hollow, Connecticut. Eventually, you'll come upon this scene. Now that's definitely something worth investigating. Sure enough, the large stone is that of Major General John Sedgwick, one of Connecticut's heroes in the Civil War. On July 1st, 1863, as part of its invasion of the Union, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia encountered the Army of the Potomac just outside of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Before nightfall, they had pushed the Union Army back through the town to defensive positions south and east. At this point, George Meade's tired forces were the only thing standing between Lee and a march on Washington, D.C. from the rear. Knowing he needed reinforcements, Meade sent for Sedgwick's 6th Corps, 35 miles away in Manchester, Maryland. Sedgwick marched his troops the entire distance in 19 hours, arriving to bolster Meade's lines against the evening's Confederate attacks on July 2nd and against Pickett's charge on the 3rd.
If the Battle of Gettysburg had gone the other way, who knows if this nation would have survived as a unified entity? Sedgwick was a large part of that. And he's right here!
The structure across the street is a monument further honoring Sedgwick's entire military career. He fought and died on the most important battlefields in American history. But what better place to spend eternity than the hamlet in which he was born? Not far from the urban center that is Hartford, nestled snugly beside the picturesque Farmington River, lies Windsor, the first town to be settled in Connecticut. The oldest church in the oldest town was organized in 1630, but at that time the congregation was located in England. Like their better-known counterparts in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, they endured the ocean voyage to settle in North America rather than conform to the Church of England. That sounds really old, but at first glance, all of the gravestones in the churchyard look relatively modern. But one day, while browsing in the University of Arizona library, I found a book that tipped me off to a real gem. In fact, when you finally find the stone I'm after, it's in such good shape that you'll find it hard to believe. Many sources list it as the oldest legible gravestone in all of New England.
Here lieth Ephraim Witt, sometimes teacher to the Church of Windsor, who died September 4th, 1644. Who when he lived, we drew our vital breath, who when he died, his dying was our death. Who was the stay of state, the Church's staff. Alas, the time forbids an epitaph.
Let's put that into some perspective. In 1644, King Charles I was still alive in England.
Even more so than his father James, Charles believed in the divine right of kings. He not only alienated lots of religious groups, but he also ran afoul of Parliament, and it cost him his life. On this side of the Atlantic, however, life went on pretty much normally. Although I'd like to think that Witt's stone is undamaged since before Oliver Cromwell's rule, it's possible that the monument was recarved later. Part of the reason is that the other side of the table bears a different and much later epitaph. As we'll see, Witt's original marker may have been the flat top stone, now worn smooth. Still, he ministered in a place so remote it needed palisade walls to guard against attacks by wolves and Indians. Other sites in Palisado Cemetery can inspire you to philosophical inquiry.
Is there life after death? There's no way to be sure, but take a look at this. Here was buried Mrs. Huldah Moore. Later on, a tree grew. Now think about where the roots are going. I think there's a good chance that Mrs. Moore's molecules are still alive and well in this tree.
One of the first places where I can really remember investigating and not merely admiring stones was Snow Cemetery in Ashford, a few miles from where I grew up. I had to meet someone nearby, and I arrived very early. While I waited, I decided to take a stroll through the burial ground. Some of the carvings seemed unusual, even to my untrained eye.
I noticed that a lot of the gravestones in this particular cemetery appeared to be made by people who are not professional gravestone makers. This is the stone of Sarah Bugby. Notice how the letters are not really on a line with the rest of the stone. Notice how the shapes of the letters vary across the stone. Notice how the shape of the stone itself is not very carefully dressed. Turns out there are other homemade stones over here, 1740s, over here, hardly legible. I wondered what would make it so there would be so many stones that appeared to be homemade in a single graveyard.
What if there had been an epidemic in the area, and burials were becoming too frequent for families to afford expensively carved stones? I did some research and discovered that, indeed, there were numerous outbreaks of influenza, scarlet fever, and long fever in New England during these decades. Does that mean my hypothesis is confirmed? Not by a long shot. Very few personal medical histories survive from this era, unless they're carved onto the gravestones themselves. Also, historians are still piecing together more complete records of the stone carvers in the area. Perhaps the ones I found were not homemade at all, but made by a local student of the Norwich ovoid carver. He was a professional who worked in a rather primitive style. But the important part of all this is that an observation I made led me to investigate further and to learn something about the area where I grew up. You can do the same thing. In the other direction from my parents' house can be found the town of Lebanon and its Trumbull Cemetery. I used to ride my bicycle here before I was old enough to have to work during the summers. I used to wander through here on sunny afternoons and get to know the people who would have been my neighbors 2 centuries earlier. In a single 2 or 3 acre piece of land, we find Jonathan Trumbull, who used to be the governor of Connecticut, and William Williams, who signed the Declaration of Independence, and who lived just up the road there by the Green. But we also find some of the most personal and heart-wrenching testimonials to family tragedy I've ever seen on gravestones.
Job, the son of Jonathan and Hannah Metcalf, died March the 24th, 1715. Age, 2 years, 4 months, 1 day.
This is Sarah Cushman, who died in 1726, and this is her husband Thomas, who died in 1727. And here are the 2 sons of James Clark, Ernest, who died in 1775 at age 3, and Augustus, who died in 1781 at age 15. He drowned in North Pond.
The list goes on. 13-year-old Naomi Eliza Hatch was killed by lightning on June 12, 1825, and John and Elizabeth Adler lost both of their twin sons born August 7, 1759, one instantly and the other the next morning. This graveyard makes it clear that for every Jonathan Trumbull and William Williams, there was a whole host of people for whom life was nasty, brutish, and short. Another place that brings you face to face with history is the town's ancientest burial place in New London. I don't know if it's the majestic weeping elm that dominates the place, the unkempt landscaping, or the incredible variety of stone styles present, but I feel closer to those departed here than anywhere else. The place does have its star attractions.
Most interesting man in the world? Forget about that guy from the beer commercial. This one gets my vote. Richard Lord was only 51 when he died, but by that time, he was a mounted soldier, he was a state representative, he was a lawyer, he was a philanthropist, he was a financier, and possibly even a pirate.
An epitaph on Captain Richard Lord, who died May 17, 1662, age 51. The bright star of our cavalry lies here, unto the state a counsellor full dear, and to the truth a friend of sweet content, to Hartford town a silver ornament, who can deny to poor he was relief, and in composing proxy he was chief. To merchants as a patron he might stand, adventuring dangers new by sea and land.
Wow. And Lord wasn't the only progressive one in New London.
Even though the graves aren't marked, this corner of the cemetery contains some of the very first public burials of free African Americans.
But there's more to this cemetery than just Richard Lord and all of the other people who are buried here. Perhaps you can just make out that stone tower across the river. That marks the site of the Battle of Fort Griswold. This fort, guarding the Groton Heights and the city of New London, was sold out to the British in 1781 by America's best-known trader, Benedict Arnold. After taking Fort Griswold, the British burned the city of New London itself. Arnold later died a pauper in England, so you won't find his grave anywhere nearby. But his mother is buried in the Arnold's hometown, at another place I used to live, the city of Norwich. The story of Fort Griswold is personal to me because my friends and I used to come to the ancientist burial place to watch New London's Sailfest fireworks every July. Thought I was being really clever, but it turns out the idea was not mine. Benedict Arnold, to remain safe, watched the Battle of Fort Griswold from this very cemetery. And just think, by that time, Richard Lord had already been lying here for 119 years. For the final stop on our Connecticut graveyard tour, I'd like to show you Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven, just beside the campus of Yale University. If you could only visit one burying ground in the state, this would be a great choice.
How many cemeteries have their own website, searchable registry, and guided tours?
Grove Street contains memorials from the entire history of New Haven, including one belonging to a passenger on the Mayflower. Originally, all of the burials in New Haven happened around the churches on the town's green. But as the burying space became more crowded and the land was set aside for public use, New Haven opened Grove Street Cemetery and moved the burials from the green. All of the stones moved from the New Haven Green are found along the western and northern walls of Grove Street Cemetery. There are so many stones here, providing such a huge sample, that you can learn lots of things about people, about gravestones, and even about sociological conventions that would take you years to discover if you look through other cemeteries. Some examples? Honor and Abigail Dye had a child named Honor who died in 1789. He was 1.5 years old. Later, they had another child also named Honor for his father, who was only 4 months old when he died in 1790. How many people today would give their child the same name as his older dead brother and his father?
Sleep, lovely babes, and take your rest. God called thee home because he thought it best.
When Ebenezer Bassett died in 1721, record-keeping was so inexact that apparently nobody knew for sure exactly when he had been born. More often, you'll come across a stone like that of John Blakesley, who died on March 12th, 1712 or 13? Is this another example of missing or incomplete public records? No, quite the opposite. Since the 12th century, March 25th had been New Year's Day in England, and by extension, its colonies in North America. In 1582, Pope Gregory introduced calendar reform, which, among other things, fixed January 1st as New Year's Day. Of course, England and its colonies, stubbornly Protestant since Henry VIII, held out against the change until 1752. Still, in acknowledgement of the fact that change was in the air, Many records of dates between January 1st and March 25th in the years before 1752 list 2 years to show that the year was, for example, 1712 Old Style and 1713 New Style. Still, as a historian, I should have known that the best was yet to come. The cemetery is bounded on one side by Ashman Street.
Sure enough, the very first grave you encounter when you enter the cemetery is that of abolitionist Jehudi Ashman. He and his American Colonization Society were instrumental in setting up a colony in Liberia, Africa, so that freed African American slaves could have a fair shake and a homeland. Charles Goodyear invented vulcanized rubber. If you drove anywhere today, say thanks to this guy. Walter Camp essentially invented American football. You can thank him all the fall and the winter. With a name like Eli Whitney Blake, how could you not become an inventor? Sure enough, he was Eli Whitney's nephew, and he invented the stone crushing machine, which was used to make roads for commerce in early America. But, perhaps more importantly, his brother Philos invented the corkscrew. Roger Sherman, buried here, signed all of the important founding documents in the United States history: the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. Now, unfortunately, his original stone has deteriorated to the point that it's no longer legible. So in 1941, a group of descendants of signers of the Declaration erected a new one that you can still read to this day.
I'm in American history heaven, and yet the coup de grace lies along the row of burials known as Cedar Avenue.
Abolitionist minister Lyman Beecher was the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Eli Whitney's cotton gin may have indirectly caused the Civil War, and his innovation in interchangeable gun parts allowed people to kill each other more efficiently during the Civil War. Noah Webster, of dictionary fame, helped to make American English distinct from its British forebearer.
But only in Grove Street could you find them right next to each other like some kind of double play combination. There's Beecher to Whitney to Webster. There seems to be no end to the fascinating sights in this cemetery. You can trace the progression of stone carving styles in one city. You'll wonder if you were transported to Egypt. You can find a memorial to bandleader Glenn Miller, whose body is still missing from World War II. And burial plots at Grove Street are still available for purchase. You too could make this your final resting place. But one thing's for sure, after exploring Grove Street Cemetery, you'll certainly need a rest.
Believe me, those are just the highlights. I wish I could show you more, but there are far too many graveyards, even in a state the size of Connecticut, to film in any reasonable length of time. While I was making this film, our local paper published an article about how the town's burying grounds were falling into disrepair. Apparently, the law says that the town may make arrangements to care for public graveyards, but they are not required to, and they haven't. It made me think what a great civic project it would be for anyone who enjoys perusing cemeteries to help maintain or even restore them. But be sure to check with your local authorities to find any regulations about doing this. The rules will vary widely. Plus, gravestones may seem really durable, but after a couple of 100 years exposure to the elements, they are quite fragile. Even well-intentioned maintenance, like cutting weeds with a string trimmer, can actually do them serious harm. A website called ctgravestones.com mostly gives information specific to Connecticut, but its section on maintenance provides many important cautions if you want to tackle a project such as this. I'm sure there's similar information available about organizations that help care for cemeteries near where you live, so think about helping out. But whatever you do, go out and explore. You'll be surprised what you can learn.